Her voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp, echoing, impossible to ignore. Kamala Harris leaned forward, eyes flashing, fingers stabbing the space between her and Jasmine Crockett, as if the stage itself might split under the force of her anger. The audience jolted in their seats. Some gasped, others exchanged wide-eyed glances, unsure if they were watching politics or a public meltdown. Cameras zoomed in, catching every curl of the lip, every twitch of impatience, amplifying the clash of power that was just beginning. On stage, spotlights seemed to magnify the moment. The hum of whispers rippled across the hall, 1,000 people, struggling to make sense of what they were witnessing. Phones lifted instantly into the air, recording, broadcasting, capturing what felt like history mid-eruption. The sound of her raised voice ricocheted across feeds, hashtags ignited in real time, and in the middle of it all stood Jasmine Crockett still, unshaken, her gaze level and unflinching dot to the crowd. It looked like two storms colliding, on one side a blaze of fury, on the other an ocean of calm so vast it threatened to swallow the firehole. There was an almost cinematic contrast. The vice president, visibly rattled, voice climbing higher, veins tightening along her throat. Crockett, steady as a statue, hands folded, her silence radiating more force than the scream itself. Every second became heavier, as if even the air didn't dare move, and the gasp wasn't confined to the stage. Online, the confrontation was already exploding. Screens lit up with comments. "Are you seeing this? She's completely lost it. Watch Crockett, she hasn't even flinched." Clips were being sliced, relooped, slowed down in dramatic. The effect turned into instant viral fodder before the debate had even ended. What began as a shout was morphing into something larger, a symbol of ego clashing violently with dignity. Every eye in the venue searched for Crockett's reaction. Would she rise to meet anger with anger? Would she fold under the pressure of standing nose to nose with raw political power unleashed? Around her you could feel hearts pounding, breaths held, aching for resolution. And in that suspended eternity, the power dynamic flipped. The louder Harris grew, the more commanding Crockett's silence became. But no one on that stage or watching at home was prepared for how she'd answered that, to understand why that scream shook the room so violently. You have to see the deeper layers beneath the surface. This was never just two politicians disagreeing on a stage. It was a collision of worlds, of philosophies, of visions for what leadership should look like in America. Kamala Harris, with years of power radiating behind her, vice president, a household name, a force trained across courtrooms, campaigns, and the national spotlight, stood towering on one side. Jasmine Crockett, a fresh but fierce presence, was building her reputation not on volume or titles, but on the raw authenticity of a rising star. By all traditional measures, Harris carried the weight of authority, but that night it became dangerously clear that authority alone doesn't guarantee command. Every debate stage tells a story, and this one told it in the sharpest relief. That an established face of power pressing down on an emerging voice, demanding submission through a raised voice rather than earned respect. What Harris may have intended as dominance instead looked like desperation. Her scream wasn't just a moment of passion, it was a public question mark about her composure, her judgment, and the very definition of leadership. What is strength in politics? Is it sheer volume, or is it the ability to stand firm when the room tries to shake you? For Crockett, that stage was more than an arena. It was an inheritance test. She represented the promise of a new chapter in American political life, unapologetic, resilient, a reflection of communities whose voices have too often been dismissed as too small to matter. Here was an immigrant-rooted energy, the spirit of underrepresented America, standing toe-to-toe with high office power and refusing to flinch. The stakes weren't just personal, they were generational, and the audience felt it. Every gasp wasn't only about Harris's tone, it was about what simmered beneath the long pattern of women, especially black women, being shouted down, underestimated, told to shrink. Crockett's unbending.com was no accident. It was a mirror held up to the nation's conscience, asking, does dignity still matter in the public square? The contrast grew sharper by the second. Harris, once celebrated as a trailblazer, now framed as the aggressor, each word rising like a hammer. Crockett's silence was the anvil, refusing to be broken. The symbolism was almost unbearable, the veteran against the newcomer, establishment against grassroots, force against poise. Watching Americans weren't just analyzing talking points, they were measuring character. Across living rooms, coffee shops, and phone screens, whispers turned into arguments. Is this what leadership looks like? Do we really reward shouting over substance? Why does she look braver saying nothing than Harris does screaming? The debate became bigger than either individual. It became a referendum on political culture itself. Both women, in that instant, stood as avatars of a broader question. Harris embodied the allure and pitfalls of institutional authority, the temptation to wield power like a weapon. Crockett embodied the rising hope that politics could be more than raised voices. It could be resilience, wit, and unshakable self-respect. For the progressive, immigrant-friendly audience watching from afar, it was more than entertainment. It was validation, the kind that feeds identity and affirms belief. Crockett was carrying their story under the blistering gaze of the national stage, and as tempers rose, the nation braced for a moment that would define both women. Kamala Harris entered the debate stage carrying with her not just the title of vice president but the aura of someone who had spent decades shaping, bending, and battling within the machinery of American politics. She was polished, precise, and unmistakably confident. Few doubted her ability to command attention. She had built an entire career on doing just that. From her early years as a prosecutor in California, through her term as Attorney General, and eventually into the Senate, Harris had earned her reputation as someone who could deliver sharp blows in a courtroom or on live television. Her style was often framed as fearlessness. To supporters, it felt like a badge of strength. To critics, it sometimes registered as something harder, an over-reliance on force over finesse. The media amplified this duality at every turn. When Harris first burst onto the national spotlight, she was celebrated as a groundbreaking figure, a woman of color ascending into a space that had long been reserved for others. Early profiles painted her as tenacious, savvy, impossible to intimidate, but the same headlines that praised her for breaking barriers often hinted at cracks beneath the surface. Was her assertiveness actually arrogance? Was her confidence occasionally hollow, masking an uncertainty she never let anyone behind the curtain see? Her campaign for president in 2020 captured this contradiction vividly. Harris opened with dynamism, sharp soundbites, pointed takedowns of rivals, and an ability to seize a spotlight with 10 words when others needed 30. But momentum didn't last. Critics began to point to inconsistencies in her record: a tough-on-crime prosecutor reinventing herself as a progressive reformer, a senator promising bold policies while hesitating to anchor them firmly. Those contradictions became fuel for doubt. Instead of clarifying who Harris was, they left voters asking an uncomfortable question: who exactly is she in this moment? And yet, her survival in politics has never rested on vulnerability. Harris has leaned on the commanding presence she wears like armor. She doesn't enter a room quietly. When she speaks, it is with the kind of declarative certainty that leaves little room for rebuttal. But that strength, over time, grew into a reflex, a habit that sometimes mistook volume for persuasion. What once looked like toughness began to simmer with impatience. Allies occasionally recounted stories of her quick temper behind closed doors, of frustrations spilling out in clipped tones, while others smoothed conflict with careful gestures. Harris often barreled through with words sharpened to cut rather than mend from the outside. This pattern rarely dented her aura of power. After all, politics often rewards the loudest voice, the most forceful presence. Harris played that role with ease. She was the hammer in a space where being a hammer could elevate you to the highest stage. Yet cracks have a way of widening with pressure, and her contradictions between new progressive image and past prosecutor record, between dignified leader and impatient scold, sat like fault lines beneath her feet. The media's portrayal magnified the drama. On one day, headlines hailed her groundbreaking story as the first woman vice president, a moment of history frozen in triumph. On another, columnists dissected her approval ratings with surgical precision, routinely portraying her as struggling to connect with everyday Americans. The larger-than-life persona both adored and doubted became the backdrop that made her every move subject to amplified reaction. Each laugh, each quip, each flash of irritation was passed as if it revealed more about the inner workings of her leadership than any policy speech ever could. By the time she stepped onto the debate stage opposite Crockett, Harris had accumulated years of this public scrutiny. She had prevailed over countless moments by doubling down on presence, by using the force of her personality to seize the narrative, before any rival could wedge themselves in. To many in the audience, she carried herself not just as a participant, but as someone accustomed to being the final word. Her voice carried the weight of expectation, her body language radiating a quiet assumption of superiority. And yet, that very confidence carried within it the seeds of her combustible moment. When confronted with challenges she didn't anticipate, with rivals unwilling to yield, her instinct was domination. To show strength, she raised her voice. To reassert control, she sharpened her tone. On numerous occasions in her career, that approach was enough to end the contest right then, and there few dared to push back. Even fewer could withstand the barrage without faltering, but therein lay the paradox. The stronger her confidence appeared, the less prepared she stood for someone who would refuse to be moved. Harris's signature approach left no room for the unexpected. If volume failed, what was left? If the scream reverberated but didn't shatter the opponent, what came next? Few had tested that proposition. Most bent in the face of the storm. That night, however, something was different. Harris entered the debate with the same unshakable drive that had propelled her from courtroom battles to the vice presidency. She leaned on her years of experience, convinced that the old playbook force dominance volume would once more carry the day. And as she raised her voice against Jasmine Crockett, the old reflex repeated itself in front of cameras, lights, and millions watching. Her confidence looked unshakably until the exact second Crockett stepped up. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive on that stage by accident, nor by privilege handed down from gilded halls of power. Her story reads more like a long road walked with grit and persistence, a testament to the kind of determination that grows in neighborhoods where opportunity is scarce and only those willing to push through barriers ever see daylight. Born without the insulation of wealth or old guard connections, Crockett learned early that survival demanded more than ambition. It demanded resilience. School days weren't gilded with tutors or inherited prestige. They were late nights of study, balancing part-time work, and carrying the unspoken responsibility of proving that her community, her family, her very identity, deserved to be heard in rooms that had shut her kind out for generations. While others coasted, she clawed, and every small victory carved into her spirit a belief that dignity earned in the trenches rings louder than status gifted at birth. Her journey into law and public service was anything but linear. After finishing her studies, Crockett turned her attention not toward boardrooms or corporate firms that would have easily welcomed her with lucrative offers, but toward the marginalized clients who often walked into courtrooms already feeling judged, forgotten, or written off by the system. She represented protesters, the working poor, immigrants juggling endless paperwork nightmares. She carried their stories until they bled into her own. In every courtroom she became known not for theatrics, but for poise, the kind of quiet fire that cannot be rattled, even when outnumbered or drowned out. There were times when the costs weighed heavily. Long hours blurred into exhaustion. Paydays sometimes paled against the pressure of mounting student loans and basic costs of living, yet Crockett kept stepping forward. If her community couldn't afford a champion, then she would build herself into one. She believed politics wasn't an ivory tower for elites. It was a kitchen table crowded with voices that deserved representation, whether or not they carried a billionaire's last name. Her opponents often underestimated her. Some dismissed her as too new, too blunt, too unwilling to play by the soft rules of polite society. They underestimated her precisely because she didn't shout or showboat. Her style appeared deceptively gentle, but underneath that calm exterior pulsed a core of steel forged by years of navigating doubt, debt, and systemic obstacles. What others mistook as meekness was actually discipline. What they thought of as deference was composure. Her community work made her beloved far beyond the halls of politics. She was the local who never forgot where she came from, the voice who sat with residents in church basements and community centers, listening before speaking. She knew the names of teachers, the struggles of single mothers, the fear of immigrants, who wondered if tomorrow meant deportation. Crockett carried those fears as her own. Every speech, every campaign stop, every appearance wasn't about self-promotion. It was a reflection of the stories entrusted to her. There's a story told in her district about a night that reveals who she really is. A winter storm had hit, leaving power lines down and families freezing without electricity. Crockett didn't grandstand for cameras or send out a press release. Instead, she organized volunteers, drove through icy streets, showing up with blankets and food, lifting morale as neighbors bundled together in cold living rooms. No microphone captured it, but those moments stitched her indelibly into the community. She wasn't a figure of power towering above them. She was one of them, and when she entered politics officially, her campaigns always felt more like movements of people than machines of money. Few believed she could win her seat. Established insiders rolled their eyes at her lack of donor networks or seasoned consultants. But just as she had done her whole life, Crockett leaned into persistence. Door by door, voice by voice, she built momentum. The underestimated candidate started sweeping small forums with authenticity that no amount of funding could buy. On election night, when the votes were tallied and her name rose to the top, she didn't just become a politician, she became living proof that underestimated voices cannot be silenced forever. Her defining trait, her calm, flowed not from meekness but from having survived battles that could have crushed others. She didn't need to scream to be heard, because her very survival screamed louder than words. Every boulder in her path had been pushed aside, not with rage, but with relentless steadiness. That steadiness translated into a style that unnerved her rivals. While they searched for vulnerabilities in her armor, they couldn't grasp that her power came precisely from refusing to lose control. When she walked onto that debate stage, she carried all of this on her shoulders: the freezing winters, the long nights of study, the murmurs of doubt she had drowned with results, the family she had represented, and the community that had chosen her as their champion. In a world that often rewards bluster, she embodied a counter-philosophy, that true authority emanates from quiet strength anchored in service. And so, as the lights blazed and the cameras tilted to capture the confrontation, Crockett's biography wasn't just background, it was the armor she wore invisibly. People watching didn't just see a young leader, they saw the reflection of everyone who had ever been underestimated, dismissed or shouted down, and yet found the strength to keep going. That steady calm would be tested under blinding lights, and a scream meant to break her. The air inside the hall grew heavier as the debate wore on, each exchange carrying more heat than the one before. At first, the interruptions from Kamala Harris came as sharp interjections, small darts meant to pierce Crockett's answers before they could gain momentum. A clipped laugh here, a pointed "excuse me" there. The crowd shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the pattern. What had begun as a contest of ideas was morphing into a test of endurance, and Harris was pressing harder with every second. Harris had mastered this tactic over her long career: keep her opponent off balance, force them to play defense. She leaned on it now, catching Crockett mid-sentence, slicing into her remarks with polished barbs. The tone dripped with condescension, as if to remind both Crockett and the audience who was the seasoned veteran. Each interruption was delivered with that trademark half-smile, confident, but increasingly forced, a smile stretched thin by irritation hiding just beneath dot. And yet, what stole the room's attention wasn't the interruptions, it was the way Jasmine Crockett absorbed them. She didn't recoil, didn't grimace, didn't rush. Instead, she paused, listened, and held her ground with an almost unbearable patience. Her posture never faltered, shoulders squared, gaze steady, hands calmly folded at the podium. She let Harris's words pass like stones thrown into a river, making ripples but never changing the current. The effect was electric. The more Crockett maintained composure, the more the audience could feel the imbalance between the two women widening. Viewers leaned forward, watching the tension mount like a storm. Behind Crockett's.com, there was power, a kind of silent defiance that made Harris's interruptions feel louder, harsher, more desperate than they might have otherwise. The crowd, sensing the tilt, began to murmur. Each time Harris cut in, the whispers swelled. Was she losing control? Did she realize that in trying so hard to dominate, she was revealing her own insecurity? By the halfway mark, the polite sparring had evaporated. What remained was a growing sense of hostility, raw and unguarded. Harris's words sharpened into accusations, that Crockett was too inexperienced, that she lacked the depth to lead, that her calmness was evidence of hollowness rather than substance. Every barb landed with exaggerated emphasis, her voice climbing, her gestures widening. She seized her microphone like a weapon, her cadence growing clipped, forceful, ratcheted up with each jab. Meanwhile, Crockett's stillness became the story. She responded rarely in those moments, preferring instead to let Harris unravel under her own weight. That silence was deafening. In the audience, gasps appeared after Harris's harshest interruptions, gasps not of admiration, but of discomfort. People exchanged looks, uneasy at the imbalance. Yes, they expected tension, but what they saw was domination sliding perilously into disrespect, and Harris pressed harder, pushing past the boundaries of courtesy in search of control. Gone was the courtly tempo of debate. What remained was an almost frantic attempt to reassert authority. Each sentence was a little louder than the last. Each interruption sliced more aggressively, clipping Crockett's words midstream before they could take shape. The vice president's voice rose and rose, layered with ragged frustration and sharp hostility, until it was nearly shouting at points where others might have paused for breath. Crockett did not take the bait. She barely moved, her calmness unnerving. In its steadiness, her eyes did not dart away, did not wince, did not reveal even an ounce of rattle. She simply looked back, as if saying silently, "You cannot shake me. Not here, not now." The crowd felt it. They weren't simply watching a policy debate anymore. They were watching the narrative of power shift in real time. Every interruption stripped Harris a little, made her scramble louder, while every measured silence from Crockett built anticipation, as if some inevitable reckoning hovered just beyond. The next question, and then the dam broke. What began as interruptions spiraled into outburst. Harris's voice shot upward past rhetoric into raw emotion, cutting through the auditorium with a force that jolted the entire room. It wasn't persuasion anymore. It was rage, concentrated and explosive. The hall fell into a stunned hush, every pair of eyes jolting toward Crockett, waiting, braced, breathless. And then came the breaking point, the scream heard round the hold out. The room trembled with the echo of Harris's voice, her scream still hanging like smoke in the air. For a beat, nothing moved. Not the moderators at the desk, not the cameras perched like silent witnesses, not even the audience, locked in a collective gasp that stretched out long enough to become uncomfortable. And at the center of it all, framed by the weight of lights and lenses, stood Jasmine Crockett, motionless, her expression carved into calm. She didn't rush. She didn't lift her voice to match the thunder thrown her way. Instead, she let the silence breathe. Let it crawl across the floor and up the walls until the stillness itself became louder than the shout. Seconds passed that felt like minutes. Harris shifted slightly at her podium, eyes darting as if realizing she had broken an invisible code. Crockett, in contrast, leaned ever so slightly forward, her voice quiet but pitched with steel, cutting sharp and clean through the air. "Madam Vice President," Crockett began, her tone even deliberate. "I was raised to believe that strength isn't measured by who can shout the loudest. It's measured by who can stay standing when everything around them is shaking." Gasps laced the room, not because the words were fiery, but because they were delivered with such unflinching composure. The crowd leaned in, sensing a shift. Harris's outburst had been volcanic, but this reply was tectonic, steady enough to move the ground everyone was standing on. Crockett continued, "You may have seniority, you may have the microphone, but what I bring to this stage is my community's voice. and that voice cannot be screamed into silence. It cannot be dismissed, no matter how high the volume rises. A ripple of applause broke out, scattered at first, then swelling as more joined in. The eruption startled Harris, who blinked hard, her smile twitching nervously at the edges. Crockett, however, didn't bask in it. She pressed on, building steadily. I've listened tonight, even as I was interrupted, because that's what public service is, listening. Not talking over, not drowning out, but hearing the struggles of people who can't afford to compete in shouting matches. When someone yells, it usually isn't a sign of power. It's a sign they've run out of arguments. The words carried no venom, yet the sting was undeniable. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience like wind through tall grass. Camera lenses tightened on Harris, whose jaw stiffened, hands fidgeting against her podium. Her legendary composure, usually so assured, was slipping. Crockett leaned back slightly now, reclaiming space without lifting her voice. She let the pause settle again, her cadence measured, forcing every listener to sit with each syllable. Then, she added, with a quiet conviction that made her voice tremble with power, I was built for moments like this. My community sent me here not to bow, not to scream, but to stand. And someday, when our children watch clips from this debate, I don't want them to see who could yell the loudest. I want them to see who had the courage to stay calm. The audience broke into applause again, louder this time, and what had been a polite political event began to swell into something else entirely. People stood, clapping, whistling, their cheers cascading down the hall. Harris scrambled to smile through it, but the camera betrayed her, the tightening of her eyes, the flash of unease, the realization that her weapon had boomeranged against her. Crockett wasn't finished. She tilted her head, glanced briefly toward Harris, and added with surgical restraint, respect isn't claimed by raising your voice. Respect is earned by raising your people. And that's the work I choose. The crowd thundered in agreement. Some cheered so loudly that moderators had to call for order, but it was too late. Momentum had shifted completely. At home, millions watching could feel the electricity traveling through their screens, the intoxicating sense that a newcomer had just appended the narrative, not with louder words, but with calmer ones. Harris attempted to interject, tried to recover ground with a forced laugh and a dismissive shake of the head, but the damage hung heavy. Every twitch of her expression, every shift in posture, gave away the cracks. She looked less like a leader commanding a debate, and more like someone caught in the aftershock of an unmovable reply. Crockett's.com presence expanded until it filled the space Harris's scream had vacated. The more Harris tried to regain footing, throwing glances, forcing composure, the more obvious her unraveling appeared. The crowd knew it, the cameras knew it. Harris herself seemed to know it. Finally, Crockett finished with a remark that crystallized the reversal. Words dropped like a gavel on the moment. Dignity is louder than any scream. Tonight, let that be the lesson. The room detonated not with anger, but with applause that reverberated off walls and ceilings, drowning out everything else. It was the kind of ovation usually reserved for victory speeches. People rose to their feet, clapping longer and louder than any moderator could have anticipated. The volume of the crowd washed away the vice president's earlier scream, burying it under the thundering rhythm of hands, celebrating poise over rage on stage. Harris's face shifted through a carousel of emotions, the stunned blink, the forced grin, the tightening lips that couldn't quite conceal frustration. For perhaps the first time all night, she looked small under that spotlight. Diminished not by Crockett shouting her down, but by Crockett refusing to dot it was a cinematic reversal, the kind of drama that lives in memory. Crockett didn't need pyrotechnics or fury. She dismantled arrogance with patience, turned hostility into her stage, and left an indelible image of what calm under fire looks like. Viewers knew instantly. This was the moment they would remember, rewatch, replay endlessly, across phones and television screens. Her quiet mic drop had become louder than Harris's scream. The hall settled only after moderators pleaded for order. But the balance of power was irreversibly altered. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed was bigger than debate points. It was a seismic shift. A signature moment where all the conflict condensed into one defining exchange, but the story didn't end in that room. The world outside would magnify it. The debate had barely ended before the night morphed into something bigger than politics. It became spectacle. Flashpoint, history, written in pixels. As audience members filed out of the auditorium buzzing with disbelief and exhilaration, social media was already ablaze. On Twitter, the clip of Crockett's.com replied livid in the wake of Harris's scream was spreading at the speed of light, broken into 10-second snippets, slowed down for dramatic emphasis, subtitled in bold fonts for maximum punch. The moment became unavoidable. Anyone opening their phone was greeted with the same image. Harris, her face locked in mid-scream, split-screened against Crockett's serene gaze that looked as steady as mountain stone. Hashtags exploded into trending dominance within minutes. Hashtag come over chaos. Hashtag dignity speaks. Hashtag Crockett mic drop. By sunrise, one tag in particular, hashtag strength is come hard, climbed to #1 globally. The meme factories cranked into action, producing endless variations. Harris red-faced above captions. Reading volume does not equal vision, juxtaposed against Crockett framed with angelic lighting, below the text poise greater than noise. Even late-night comedians couldn't resist, with monologues quickly drafting the scream verses. The calm as the newest shorthand for political clashes in America, but beyond the viral memes lay something more profound. The comments flooding underneath those clips read like a collective exhale from millions who longed for a public figure to embody their frustration and their hope all at once. She didn't just speak for herself, she stood for us. Finally, someone showing that we don't have to imitate rage to resist it. That's my America right there. The validation wasn't quiet, it was thunderous. Every share became an act of solidarity, every retweet a declaration. Crockett had spoken for them, not just to them. Celebrities quickly joined the chorus. Musicians, actors, and cultural figures posted the now iconic clip with words of admiration. One actor wrote, "This is how you break through hate," with composure and brilliance. A Grammy-winning singer wrote simply, "We don't need more screamers, we need more builders." Respect. Fashioned into TikToks remixed with inspirational soundtracks, Crockett's retort became more than a debate. Highlighted was resurrected as a cultural anthem. Other politicians felt the ripple. Immediately, progressive leaders rushed to praise the moment, framing it as a turning point in how the party chooses its champions. Statements rolled in. "This is what grace under fire looks like," wrote one senator. Another tweeted, "Crockett showed the world what true leadership is about, listening and standing tall." Even some of Harris's own allies struggled to defend her outburst, knowing instinctively the optics were irrecoverable once the comparisons began spreading across millions of screens. And it wasn't just elites. Everyday Americans, teachers, nurses, first-generation immigrants, students taped their own phone camera reactions. Videos surfaced of families huddled around TVs cheering when Crockett looked Harris in the eye and calmly struck back. Clips from watch parties showed eruptions of applause in living rooms and college dorms. Strangers hugging as if they themselves had delivered the words. It wasn't politics now, it was communion. A mass resonance across people who often felt invisible. News channels joined the frenzy, each segment replaying the scream versus calm dynamic on loop. Commentators dissected body language, replayed the long, suspenseful pause before Crockett's first word, analyzed the thunderous applause that followed. One analyst summed it up bluntly, "In 15 seconds of calm, she reversed years of narrative." This wasn't a debate win, this was a cultural reset. Even international outlets seized the story. European papers carried headlines about the calm American who stole the debate. In Latin America, commentators praised Crockett as embodying immigrant resilience and dignity, noting how her composure connected deeply to global audiences, who understood too well the experience of being shouted down yet refusing to break. The shockwaves were unmistakable. Harris's scream was the sound people heard, but Crockett's reply was the song that lingered. Every replay online proved the same point. Volume can vanish in an instant, but poise imprints itself permanently. Millions scrolling on their phones felt affirmed in a way few political moments ever manage. Crockett hadn't just answered Harris. She had answered the larger hunger for leaders who embody both strength and softness, conviction and composure. By the next morning, donations to Crockett's campaign page surged. Volunteers flooded her offices with calls offering to sign up. Journalists labeled her the new face of grace under fire, while communities tagged her moment as ours. America had seen a newcomer absorb a scream and turn it into a cultural echo chamber, shouting back with pride. Yet beneath the celebration lay the lingering weight of the question the night had raised. If strength could no longer be defined by decibels, what did it mean for the future? Could politics reinvent itself around dignity instead of dominance? Or would the establishment double down, uneasy with what had just been revealed to millions? Watching those were questions not even memes or applause could immediately answer, and as the dust settled, the question remained: what greater lesson could America take from this? When the echoes of applause faded and the viral reels slowed down, what remained wasn't just a soundbite, it was a symbol. The confrontation between Kamala Harris and Jasmine Crockett had transcended politics. It was no longer about debate points or campaign strategy sheets. It had crystallized into an allegory, a mirror held up to America's conscience. On one side, ego shouting to assert its dominance. On the other, dignity refusing to be shaken, proving that the deepest form of strength doesn't thunder, it resonates for days after. The scene replayed itself in the minds of millions, the scream and the silence that followed, the eruption and the calm, the volume and the composure. Harris represented an old reflex of American politics, the reflex to believe that fury proves superiority, that intimidation carves victory. But Crockett represented a counter-philosophy, one born of new leadership styles rising across the country. The leader who listens before speaking, who absorbs rather than explodes, who transforms pressure into poise. In her stillness, she revealed the hollowness of rage. In her calmness, she revealed the courage of restraint. The deeper lesson was simple, yet universal. True strength isn't measured by how loud you command a room, it's measured by how calmly you carry it. A scream fades the instant it's spoken. Composure lingers long after. Crockett's reply became a cultural reminder that leadership rooted in dignity resonates further than any shouted command. Generationally, her moment landed like a baton pass. For younger Americans, especially those from immigrant families, communities of color, or historically silenced voices, Crockett's answer wasn't just a political quip, it was validation. It spoke directly to every person who has ever been underestimated, shouted over, told to shrink, told to wait their turn. Watching her stand calm under fire was not just witnessing a rebuttal, it was witnessing themselves reclaim dignity on a national stage. It gave rise to hope that the fabric of democracy might yet be rewoven with new threads. Leaders chosen not because they can dominate a microphone, but because they can embody steadiness when the room trembles. America has always thrived, not when its leaders screamed the loudest, but when they reminded its people of their quiet collective power. Crockett's.com was more than a retort, it was a manifesto, stitched in real time. A new kind of leadership is not only possible, it is necessary. And so audiences didn't replay that moment dozens of times only to marvel at her wit. They replayed it because it held a universal promise that calm courage is contagious. Watching her, they felt steadier themselves. Watching her, they felt vindicated in believing that anger is not the only answer to injustice. Watching her, they felt proud, as though the dignity she carried was borrowed and shared with everyone who needed it. This is where the true inspiration lies. Crockett's reply wasn't confined to her podium. It radiated outward into living rooms, school classrooms, subway commutes, and headlines around the world. For a fleeting but powerful moment, it reminded people that democracy at its best is not about shouting each other down, it's about lifting each other up. That is the rare kind of political moment that doesn't just win debates, it renews faith. And as the lights dimmed on that debate stage, the imagery could not have been clearer. Harris standing as a symbol of volatility that cannot sustain itself, Crockett as a symbol of dignity steady enough to endure. Their exchange was not merely about who won the night, it was about what qualities America chooses to value in its leaders, and by extension, in itself. The moral is plain yet piercing. Ego crumbles under its own weight, but calm dignity stands tall. Strength is not the scream that demands attention, it is the composure that earns respect. And in that lesson lies the seed of something bigger than politics, an invitation to every viewer who witnessed it, to carry themselves with the same steadiness when the world raises its voice against them. Invitation, more than Crockett's applause or Harris's falter, is what lingers. Pride, uplift, energy renewed. A reminder that the best of America has always been written not in rage, but in resolve. And from that night forward, many believed they had caught a glimpse of the future. A politics of dignity, a democracy reborn not in shouts but in calm strength. The title of this story says it all. Kamala Harris screams at Jasmine Crockett on stage, but her calm reply stuns the crowd. And after everything we've walked through together, that title is no exaggeration. A scream may have shaken the walls, but it was Crockett's measured response that shook the nation. The image that lingers isn't the raised finger, the sharp tone, or the flaring temper, it's the calm gaze, the steady words, and the ripple of applause that reminded us what leadership looks like when it's rooted in dignity. In a world where rage so often dominates headlines and finger-pointing passes for progress, this moment etched something different into our memory. It proved that dignity does not flinch, that composure can silence chaos, and that the strongest voice in any room may in fact be the one that refuses to scream. Crockett's reply made clear, dignity conquers rage, every single time. But here's where this story becomes bigger than one stage and two people. Because it isn't just about Crockett's poise or Harris's outburst, it's about us. It's about what we choose to reward, amplify, and carry forward as a culture. The scream made noise, but the calm reply made history. Which of those we pass on to our children, to our friends, to our communities, that's in our hands now. So let this be more than a clip you replay. Let it be a reminder. Share this so others remember. Poise is power, dignity is strength. Together, we can choose leaders, and more importantly, live lives that elevate calm over chaos, respect over rage, and truth over arrogance. That's not just politics, it's America at its best.